Hello, this is my first attempt at a video blog. I just thought this blog post especially needed it because I talk about a lot of complex ideas. I make use of quite complex diagrams. Just thought I would benefit from, having an actual human voice rather than just the dry text. And also, it's just to try and get me used to my horrible, whiny, nasal voice and improve my confidence a bit in case I need to ever present at a conference or something like that. So this is the presentation I put together for my 100-day Viva, which took place last week on Friday the 11th of January 2013, and thankfully I passed it. So essentially I had to put together my research proposal and explain what I'm going to be doing for the next 3 years and justify why they should be paying me to do it. But I explained most of that in the actual presentation itself. So here we go. Hello, my name's Andrew Molloy. I am a first year PhD student based in the University of Ulster in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I am part of the Faculty of Art Design and Built Environment. I have a background in architecture. The tentative title for my research is Toward a Reflexive Urbanism, which I know possibly a little bit risky, invoking Le Corbusier in my title, but there we go. And I also hope to be looking at planning in Belfast. So to start off with, I'll just explain the background to these ideas and why I'm looking at them. I first started looking at these issues in my Master of Architecture thesis, which was entitled The Destruction of Architecture. And it sought to answer the question, what is architecture, which turned out to be absolutely massive. And then through discussions with tutors, I took the definition architecture as a social art, and then tried to investigate this definition, which ended up with me trying to define what the word social meant. So the dissertation begins with a rejection of post-Enlightenment metaphysics and move towards phenomenology and social neuroscience to explain how cultures and societies are formed. I'll return to these ideas later on. There's some quite big ideas there, and I'll talk about them whenever I actually get into my current research. I also became interested in planning issues in Belfast. This map shows a portion of the Westlake Motorway. For those of you who know Belfast, you can see St Anne's Cathedral on the bottom right of the image, with the University of Ulster just above it with the little link going across the road, and the circle in the centre middle is Carlisle Circus, and then you can see the motorway slicing through the city there. This is the same map in 1901, and this map shows the Westlink superimposed on top of it. So I just became interested. It was quite a big planning decision to put this motorway through the city, and it appears to have had quite a destructive influence in the city when we can compare the urban green in 1901 with the urban green in the contemporary map, and also considering the census information and the demographics of the area telling us that it's one of the most deprived in Northern Ireland. There are other issues there, but I certainly don't think that the Westlake Motorway has helped. So to tie this back to my MArch thesis, I see this as an act of modernist paternalism. The best example of modernist paternalism, certainly that I can think of, is Le Corbusier, who is at the top of the screen there. So he's a Swiss architect who proposed, the little model beside him, proposed to demolish a lot of the suburbs and part of the central core of Paris, and to introduce these large parks with these large cruciform skyscrapers laid out in a grid pattern. And the black and white plan shows a proposal developed in 1962 for the Lagenside area of Belfast, which is very, very similar. So a lot of Corb's ideas had an impact on this, and this idea of sort of large-scale urban plans upsetting a lot of people's lives, and a lot of established homes to make the city better. I wanted to try and find out why this was happening. I'll come back again to these ideas a bit later on. Now I would like to just talk a little bit about my methodology, my current research, and my aims and objectives. So to start off with, I would like to continue developing the model that I talked about at the start. This would involve an extensive literature review and interpretation of a series of ideas which lie in a lot of very different disciplines. I then hope to apply this model to planning in Belfast. This would involve another literature review to do with the philosophy of cartography, another literature review to do with planning history in Belfast. And then I hope to identify key actors within the planning service and interview them, and then that will hopefully enable me to critique planning maps. Then I want to test the model and the application of the model by looking at another interpretation of the city, one that's rooted in the lived experience of the city rather than the quite abstracted interpretation of the planners. And then hopefully this will enable a comparison which will just test the model to its limit as far as I can see. So now I would like to delve a little bit into the details that I've been discussing, starting with the model. As I discussed before, the theoretical model begins with post-Enlightenment thought, particularly a model devised by René Descartes, which in turn had a big influence in Sir Isaac Newton. The Enlightenment model suggests, as we can see from this diagram that I produced of it, that we are three-dimensional objects which exist in three-dimensional space with other three-dimensional objects. We are in some way special in that we can perceive these other three-dimensional objects and formulate an understanding which enables us to direct our action upon the world. The important thing to note in this model is that our subjective mind will conform to objective reality, and our mind acts as a mirror for objective reality. The question remains, from where does understanding arise? Descartes suggested that the pineal gland somehow secreted understanding as a substance that was separate from the three dimensions of our body. Other explanations include the angel in the head, and the animal spirits, and the religious concept of the soul. This is what I mean when I refer to post-Enlightenment metaphysics. It's essentially the hole in the theory, which I believe causes a lot of problems. And then if I bring this back to the modernist paternalism, you can see that it lies within this model. The modernists believed that if they altered objective reality, all subjective minds would conform in the same way, and they didn't, unfortunately. So to remedy this, I turn to the work of Martin Heidegger, specifically his writings Being and Time and Poetry, Language, Thought. I can't recommend Poetry, Language, Thought enough. It's such a pleasant book to read with some really big ideas in it, which are just excellently presented. Being and Time, however, is a nightmare. Heidegger's model suggests that Dasein is Heideggerian jargon for the perceiving being, the thing which exists and experiences the world. Dasein creates the boundaries of their own world. Objects become things when they are defined by their use, and they are related to other objects through their use, and this is where understanding arises from. These things then become arranged into projects which allow us to direct our action and shape the world with satisfying any wants or needs that we have, and this shaping of the world Heidegger refers to as dwelling. So these ideas are then made more robust by the work of the social neuroscientists. Here we have at the bottom Antonio Damasio and his diagram of the homeostatic tree. As you can see, this places complex emotions and feelings into the same system as basic metabolic regulation. For me, this is a great definition of the phenomena of phenomenology. A phenomenon can be our perception of an object by perceiving it through our senses, seeing, touching, smelling, but it can also be a delicate change in the balance of chemicals in our stomach, which makes us aware that we're hungry. Phenomena make us aware of a human want or need, allowing us to direct action in the world. And to tie this back to the work of the phenomenologists, I've used this quote at the top from Merleau-Ponty, particularly the line, "I perceive in a total way with my total being." We are fully embodied beings, and the idea, the Cartesian idea from post-Enlightenment metaphysics, that the mind can be some way separated from the body, becomes an impossibility in this. The Homeostatic Tree allows us to create a map of our body, making us aware of how we're getting on in the world, and any wants or needs that will enable us to survive for longer in the world or make our stay in this world a little bit more pleasant. So the idea, the problem remains, how do these subjective phenomena become socialized, because that's where we started, how societies are formed. So now we know how, we have an idea of how we understand the world. Now we need to find out how we communicate this to other people. So for this I turned to Pierre Bourdieu, who's at the bottom here, who was influenced by Karl Marx, who's at the top here. And for Marx, the concept of the commodity was key to his book Capital, which, as we know, was a critique of capitalist materialism. And I think it is key to understanding how subjective phenomena become socialized. Now, Marx, as I stated, was critiquing capitalist materialism, whereas we are maybe quite riskily trying to produce a more universal concept. So a lot of his terms need tweaking in this context. So Marx described commodities as possessing three things: value, which Marx defined as the product of human labour. We can then redefine as the product of human homeostasis, something that we can perceive or sense. Use value, which Marx defined as something which satisfies a human want or need, we can now redefine as something that allows us to identify a human want or need. So these two things, value and use value, define a phenomena. The third property is exchange value, which Marx defined as something which satisfies the wants or needs of more than one individual. We can redefine this as a communicable use value. To use an example, I can't understand what it feels like for you to be hungry, but the word hunger allows me to identify it with one of my own subjective phenomena, and that is a subjective phenomena that I have interpreted as I need food. You can tell me that you need food. I don't know what it feels like when you need food, but it's a shared interpretation of a subjective phenomena. So these socialized and commodified phenomena then arrange themselves into projects, much like Heidegger's things. However, the projects are now Platonic. They're idealized ways to do things. Bourdieu then described this collection of Platonic objects as the habitus. You can see the Venn diagram I have there. It's quite clear. The way I do things, the way you do things, and the part in the middle is the shared interpretation of how to be in the world. And then these two diagrams, I don't feel the need to talk about these too much. The first one on the left explains how phenomena become socialized through their exchange value, and this is a social discourse and an agreement of what our interpretation of phenomena. The one on the right explains what happens if there's a differing interpretation of phenomena. If there's more than one habitus in one space, then you have the political discourse, which results in either compromise or conflict. there has to be something going on. If there's different interpretations, then they're not going to work together in the same space, and this is what results. So now to move on to the application of the model, I want to start by looking at the philosophy of mapping or cartography. The model allows us to reevaluate the objectivity of the map. In the Cartesian view, the map is an accurate representation of objective reality. But in the light of the model, maps are no more than a representation of the interpretation of space belonging to the habitus for which the cartographer acts as agent. I think that bears repeating because it's quite a complex sentence. In the light of the model, maps are no more than a representation of the interpretation of space belonging to the habitus to which the cartographer acts as agent. Therefore, I hope to move on to apply the model to the planning process and critique the planning maps produced by the planners to try and understand Belfast's planning habitus. So I started doing this just by looking at the history of planning in Belfast. I started in 1962 for two reasons. The Matthew Plan was the first urban scale modernist project in the city, and also it predates the contemporary Troubles, which have had a big impact on people's interpretation of the city and the actual physical layout of the city. So the Matthew Plan was devised by architect Robert Matthew. It responded to the growth of Belfast by imposing a stop line, limiting the outward expansion of Belfast, and proposing a series of new towns like Craigavon, as well as the expansion of several existing towns like Lisburn and Newtownards, to try and absorb the growth of the city. And these cities would essentially become satellite commuter towns for the Belfast urban area. This then led to the 1967 proposal for the Belfast Urban Motorway, and then to the 1969 Belfast Urban Area Plan. Both of these are formalised versions of the Matthew Plan and were based on a projected surge in population. The urban motorway proposed a ring of motorways around the city core, while the area plan proposed mass slum clearance and extensive residential renewal in the areas immediately adjacent to the city centre. These plans coincided with the start of the Troubles, which resulted in a fall in population. And as you can see from this graph, the red shows the projected population in the Matthew Plan and a similar one in the area plan, and then the blue shows the actual population. As you can see, there is quite a large difference. Despite this fall in population, elements of both plans went ahead, and indeed there's a suggestion that maybe even the fall in population was due to the area plan removing a lot of housing and only putting a small proportion of it back. But I hope to understand that more as I do a bit more research into this. This then led to the 1987 Urban Area Plan, which is a very, very slim report for such a large urban area, and a lot of the intent of the plan remains unclear. There's a large A0 plan of the city with shaded areas, with no explanations of why these areas are shaded, a certain colour. There's a key to tell me what these mean, but there's, no breaking the city up into these individual areas and explaining them, which is a lot different from what we have now, which is the Belfast Metropolitan Area Plan, which was released in draft form in 2004, and it's a large stack of files. Again, a large A0 plan, shaded areas, but each area is now coded, which corresponds to a book. Look it up, and there's a short paragraph explaining the planning conditions of the area. But again, a lot of the intent and motivation isn't evident. It's just, a list of guidelines for each area. And I hope to really get into the 1987 and the 2004 plans in my critique, my interviews with the planners and critique of their maps. These are the maps I will be critiquing. So I also found it quite important to understand how the planners slice up the city, abstract it and understand it in parts. So on the NISRA website it explains that Belfast is one of 26 local government districts in Northern Ireland. It's comprised of 9 district electoral areas, 51 wards, 150 super output areas and 912 smaller output areas. And these areas are used for census, for making demographics, and they are political divisions. So in the 2001 census, NISRA introduced the 1 kilometre square grid. The entire of Northern Ireland is divided up into this grid, and this is how Belfast is also understood by the planners. The idea is to make it an arbitrary subdivision as opposed to the electoral subdivisions. So I'll return to how I hope to use these subdivisions in a little bit, because now I'll talk about how I want to test the application and development of the model. This is the part that I'm least clear on, because I need to do more research into the model to understand how I will actually carry this out. But I hope essentially to identify an alternative habitus to the planners, one that is rooted in the lived experience of the city, one that doesn't abstract the city, and that will have to be within a smaller area, which I will hopefully identify by looking at the planners rather than looking at the entire city. Then I need to identify a range of actors or agents within the habitus, being aware of their role in the habitus, because there would be gatekeepers, there would be people who define the habitus, the more dominant role, and then there would be passive participants in the habitus, people who go along with it and subscribe to it and don't really have much power within it. And then I would need to develop a strategy for mapping this alternative habitus in a similar way to I did with the planners, but the strategy will be very much context dependent, and I'll have to be very sensitive and aware of any possible abstractions that the strategy may impose on people, which will change their interpretation of the city in that given context. It's going to be very difficult. So just to try and suggest how I might then break the city up, I have identified the old number 77 bus route, which goes from the waterworks in the north to the gasworks in the south. And it will provide a nice cross section of the city, as it bisects a lot of sectarian and social divides and comes into contact with a lot of the planning decisions that I've been discussing. It's quite a nostalgic thing, which will have a lot of subjective relations for people across the city. It's been used in art installations and documentaries and things like that, and it's essentially because it's impossible to walk this route due to a lot of the planning decisions, and it's from a time when the city was very different. So this is just an example of how I can then make use of the subdivisions. This is just the super output areas, but then I could blow it up output areas, electoral wards, etc. Or use the 1 kilometre square grid to look at specific areas. But as I said, this needs a lot of development, and that development will come as I look at the model. So this is the timeline, split up into develop, apply and test, with quite a large time for concluding, re-looking at the model in the light of the findings. And that's the next 3 years of my life right there. And then this is the question that I have arrived on at the minute. I have the statement, which is based on the model and its attitude to mapping, and then a question to direct my interrogation of the topic. So that's us, basically. And welcome any comments people have or any specific questions, just to help me develop. I had a lot of very searching questions in the Viva. It was very, very helpful. But I'm opening this up to people. So thank you very much. Thanks. Bye.